Hello, everyone. Once again, this is Pastor Terry Reese of the Valley Grace Brethren Church of Armagh, Pennsylvania. As always, we deem it a very high privilege to have you with us for this time of study and reflection, and we welcome each of you to this broadcast. We are again talking about the matter of euthanasia, what is euphemistically known as good death. This is our final message in this series. It is a fascinating case study in terms of the direction that our civilization is heading. And just to bring this into context, as this again is our final message on euthanasia, which is part of our broader series on the matter of human dignity, on the idea that man is created in the image and likeness of God, and we've been looking at certain abuses that we see in our modern society in this regard, and we talked about with regard to some of these modern attacks on what the Bible calls innocent blood. We've seen that the medical ethics of the modern world, the post-industrial world, have in fact been hopelessly corrupted. Corrupted first and foremost by the abortion culture. Life is cheap. It's expendable. And of course, where life has little or no value, death has its price. And we've seen this extend from the abortion culture into the rising euthanasia culture. We observed that various nations in the modern world have come far down this path and allow for some form of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. We mentioned the 3 Benelux countries, which have allowed euthanasia legally for 20 years, talking about Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, 3 very progressive European nations. Also, Australia, Colombia, Spain, Portugal, and we also see 10 regions or jurisdictions within the United States that allow for some form of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide. But we have not really talked much about Canada, which is one of these euthanasia nations, one of these culture of death nations. That's going to be our main focus today. No nation in the modern world has implemented euthanasia as controversially or as broadly as has the nation of Canada. And Canada will serve as a case study, as I had observed in the beginning. That's what we're looking at, a case study for what can happen to a nation when it loses its collective soul. You know, culture and law are, these things serve to modify our behavior. If you have a culture that allows these things and your legal system follows down this route, you see that it serves to modify public attitudes. For example, some 60% now, according to the Journal of American Medicine, of Dutch physicians admit that they have prescribed medication for physician-assisted suicide. Think about that, friends. Despite the fact that the original Hippocratic Oath completely disavowed such activity, giving patients something that would deliberately hasten their death, 60%, a solid majority of Dutch physicians now acknowledge that they have in fact have engaged in hastening the death of a patient, prescribing poisons. You see how the slippery slope works in terms of modifying public behavior. Now, in terms of this basic series on euthanasia, I would invite you to, if you haven't, to look at our 4 previous messages as they've been building to this grand conclusion. In our first message, we defined the various terms here and defined what euthanasia is and what physician-assisted suicide is. The first message was a definition of terms. The second message was more of a devotional type message where we looked at the whole matter of suffering within our lives. God ordains that suffering enter our lives, and often He has a redemptive purpose behind this. This is contrary to the euthanasia culture, which really says that all suffering is to be disavowed, and that when suffering comes, we should seek the hasty exit of personal destruction. Our third message dealt with the dark history of euthanasia. We started back with antiquity, with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and we came right up to modern times. And the fourth message, there we dealt with the basic ethics of life and death. What does the Bible say about suicide, assisted suicide, euthanasia? What do the Scriptures directly state should be our ethic with regard to these things? So if you haven't seen these messages, I invite you to study them. And also, if you're watching these things via YouTube, click like. That's very helpful to us. Subscribe to our channel. That's very helpful to us. And any notices that you see of these things on Facebook, please share them with your friends. We feel that the ministry here is worthwhile, and if it's been a blessing to you, we would encourage you to pass the word on that you have been blessed through this ministry. This week, we're going to be looking at a very, as I had earlier alluded to, a very interesting and instructive case study. What happens to a nation when it goes whole hog down this path? What can happen to a people? I want to talk first of all, however, before we get directly into the Canadian situation. I want to observe this, that when you're dealing with practices like abortion and euthanasia, things which serve to cheapen a society's understanding of what human life is all about, let's understand that this is all very reciprocal. In other words, these practices, abortion and euthanasia, are shaped by the culture because the culture has lost its way. These things come to pass, and you see legalization and even state encouragement of these things. But again, this is reciprocal. Even as the state and public policy embraces these things, that in turn only strengthens public support and acquiescence to these things. Once the government says abortion should be legal and even says that it's a right, and once the state begins encouraging euthanasia, that communicates a message to the general public that these things are indeed ethical and acceptable. But, in the end, friends, the public policy with regard to things like abortion and euthanasia, these things, again, are ultimately determined by how we define, as a society, the basic nature of human existence. What is our basic ethic concerning human existence? If our basic presupposition, our basic societal presupposition is that human beings are merely material, cosmic accidents, that human beings are merely members of the animal kingdom, well then it is of no real ultimate consequence if we do things like terminate the life of a child, or terminate the life of an elderly or sick person, or a person suffering from some mental challenge. On the other hand, if we begin with another presupposition, that if we are made, created in God's image, then that invests human life with great dignity, and this rules out the wanton destruction of human life. And further, it morally obligates us to nurture and protect such life that is created in the image and likeness of God. It becomes morally incumbent that we defend the innocent, that we protect the powerless. You think about Psalm 82, verse 4. We have this admonition, quote, rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from out of the hand of the wicked. Friends, if we do believe that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, when we see things in our culture that debase human life and in which we see innocent victims, yes, we have that moral obligation. You know, you think about Proverbs chapter 24, verse 11. You probably are familiar with that group associated with Randall Terry called the Rescuers. They get their name from this passage. Quote, rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. Unquote. We are called to be rescuers. Our Christian ethic demands the same. But you know, we live in what's called a postmodern culture. This postmodern culture in which we live, it questions the very idea of truth, whether or not there is such a thing as truth, and even if there is, can we even discover what the truth is? And in such a postmodern environment, things like right and wrong, these are no longer considered absolutes that are born out of the eternal heart of God. Rather, they are seen as human constructs, something that we have created ourselves for our own purposes. So we've devolved, not progressed, devolved, regressed from a culture that embraces moral absolutism into a culture of subjective moral relativism. We are a culture like Judges 21:5. You remember that famous dirge that continues throughout the book of Judges. Israel had no king, and every man did as he saw was right in his own eyes. Right and wrong are things that we construct out of our own hearts. And, when you have that kind of ethic where, in the end, right and wrong, well, in the last analysis, these things are determined by human self-interest. In the end, our own self-interest becomes our ultimate moral compass. Human rights. Human rights, according to our American founding fathers, are not human moral constructs. Our founding fathers, while they may have been children of the Enlightenment, they were also children of the First Great Awakening, that great revival that swept America with such men as George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. And their view, being Christian men, was that human rights are not something that we have constructed or invented ourselves. These are not things that are created by the human collective or by governmental institutions, by the state. Rather, human rights are something that simply exist. They are. They're part of the natural order created by nature's great God. I use that phrase, nature's God, because the very first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, our foundational document for this republic, uses that expression. Nature's God. Rights come to us through nature's God. We think about the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where we're told that these rights which come from nature's God and which govern human activity, that they are, quote, endowed by their Creator. Notice that the American Republic was based upon a presupposition of the idea that there is a God. He is the author of our rights. And indeed, friends, if we are going to have a free society and a just society and an honorable society, we need to begin right where our founding fathers began. The second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence famously observes, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, delivering their just powers from the consent of the governed. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, but there was a committee which assisted Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, Livingston, Sherman. These men understood the basis of what the basis of a just society must be. It all begins with the fact that God, not the state, has given men rights. President John F. Kennedy, I think, well summarized what the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence was saying. President Kennedy stated, quote, "The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God," unquote. Well spoken by President Kennedy. The central function of human governments, according to the Word of God, Romans 13, also going back to the root of this, Genesis 9, is the protection of human life. That's the prime directive that God has for governments, to protect innocent human life. Ligonier Ministries, in this regard, has a wonderful quote. It states, governments that protect life are good, honorable, and just. Governments that do not protect life are not good, are dishonorable, and unjust. Friends, I'll leave it to you as to where our present society falls in terms of the ledger. Are we a good, honorable, and just society? Or are we a dishonorable, unjust, and wicked society? Well, we're a society that allows abortion of the innocents, the murder of the innocents, and a society, a Western world, that moves further and further along in terms of this awful practice of euthanasia. I think the answer is very clear where we stand. Now, I want to talk about this whole matter of the slippery slope, where this is all leading us as a civilization, as a world. You know, as we look at this great tapestry of world history that leads ultimately to the Great Tribulation and then to the glorious second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, where are we headed with this? I have a verse here I want you to chew on for a moment. Genesis chapter 11, verse 6. context here deals with the evil workings of the people of the civilization of the Tower of Babel, these early descendants of Noah, who disobeyed the Lord, who did not disperse and replenish the earth and fill the earth as God had commanded, but rather sought to create a superstate, a one-world government, if you will, a state that was autonomous of God, a state which foreshadows the end times one-world state of the Great Tribulation period. A state that really foreshadows the Antichrist beast regime that is to come. But the people, they engaged in this great building project to hold them together and hold their society together. And the Lord God, the triune God, descended upon this place. And he observed the building of this tower, the symbol of their autonomy, and this symbol of their progressive ability to ascend to the stars. Isn't that what progressivism today is all about? The idea that man is evolving and that his institutions are evolving and his understanding is evolving. And, the idea is that man will be able to solve all of his problems, crime, poverty, etc., etc. The whole idea of progressivism is based upon a denial of the fall and the false concept of naturalistic human perfectibility. But the Lord descended upon this place, and he saw their tower, this hateful symbol of their rebellion, and he says, quoting the Legacy Standard Bible, which is a revision of the New American Standard Bible, and the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they have begun to do. So now, nothing which they propose to do will be impossible for them." J.P. Green's translation renders the latter part of that this way. This is what they are beginning to do. Now all which they have proposed to do will not be restrained from them, unquote. You see, friends, sin grows. This people, this rebellious people, they were now in a moral free fall. Soon, nothing would be impossible for them. And that's the way sin is, and the way human depravity is. Sin grows exponentially, and human depravity, well, it seems almost bottomless. And so the Lord intervened graciously in breaking up this civilization because it, in the moral, ethical sense, nothing awaited them other than darkness. And you see this, the same thing is true with regard to the sanctity of life, that once it's eradicated, nothing becomes impossible for us. Sin grows. Depravity just continues to expand. Even as, think about Roe v. Wade, how it paved the way for the things that we see today. Abortion on demand, abortion right up to the moment of birth. And now our legislators today can't even get together on the idea of born alive infant protection. If a child is born alive, he can still be left to die, even though that child is outside of the mother's womb, ex vitro. We can't even get together there. We're dealing with open infanticide. Again, you see, sin grows. And the same is true with euthanasia. Voluntary euthanasia only serves to pave the way for even darker things. It starts out with this wonderful libertarian battle cry, the right to die, the right to be free from suffering, the right to be in control of your own life. And once you see this matter of human life debased, then anything becomes possible, and all restraint is thrown off, and eventually the state, the all-powerful state, eventually determines that you have a duty to die. We saw this in the Third Reich. It started out with appeals to, oh, isn't it wonderful, we're relieving people of their suffering, and it ended up with mass murder. People involuntarily being taken to their deaths. So we, as a civilization, we're kind of caught in a vice. Right now we destroy life at its beginnings, and we're more and more destroying life on the other end of the arc, the elderly, and the vice continues to close. And those of us who are in the middle, oh, it's closing on us too. But I want to get right now to this case study, having said that, having sort of made that introduction. This case study deals with the nation of Canada, which I think nicely illustrates what I'm talking about when we're talking about the slippery slope. Canada is right now in the midst of a national catastrophe. Yes, there are a number of other nations which allow for euthanasia, assisted suicide, and so forth, but none more controversially than our friendly neighbor to the great white north. Canada is an extremely progressive society. Its Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is a very wicked person. He is an ultra-progressive. He really has tyrannical impulses. I mean, you look at the other year of this controversy over whether or not you can engage in so-called conversion therapy. That is the idea that you can counsel homosexuals that they can leave behind their homosexual orientation and lifestyle if they turn to the Lord. Of course, Canadian law has spoken against this, and in fact has even illegalized such counseling, and even threatens such counseling from the pulpit. And the Word of God is very clear. The Apostle Paul warns that homosexuals, yes, are shut from the kingdom of God. However, he goes on to say, such were, past tense, some of you, but now you have been regenerated. In other words, Paul is saying what Canadian law says you shouldn't be saying, namely that regardless of how you became a homosexual, what your ideas are about that, the fact is you can leave that behind, definitely. Nowadays it's popular to say, well, we're born with that inclination, but regardless of what the cause is, whether it be nature or nurture, the point is it's sin. The inclination is sin, but God says He can deliver and rescue, definitely, from this sin. Canada, however, tyrannically seeks to shackle Christian counselors who say the same thing that Paul did, seeks to shut down Christian pastors who say the same thing that Paul did. You wonder when they're going to start burning Bibles. The Bible, a hate book. The reason that Canada has passed this legislation is because it's claiming that Christian counselors are engaging in misinformation and abuse by simply telling them homosexuals the same thing that Paul does. But this is the kind of nature, the nature of the Canadian regime, a wicked regime. And of course, you look last year what they did to the truck drivers. Just a society that values civil liberties in a manner that is very, shall we say, very slight. But this matter of euthanasia, having set the context that this is the kind of nation that Canada is, this socialistic, fascistic nation that's ruled by awful people, unchristian people. This Canadian program is known as MAiD, M-A-I-D. It's a wonderful anagram. The world has these wonderful anagrams. It means medical assistance in dying. How wonderful. You can have medical assistance in your murder. Okay? But this first became law in the year of our Lord, June 2016. And I'll walk you through the process here. Prior to 2015, the Canadian Criminal Code had uniformly prohibited euthanasia and assisted suicide as something that was a form of culpable homicide. It was illegal as recently as 2015. But then in 2015, something happened. What was that something? Well, with the encouragement of various Canadian so-called civil rights groups, kind of like the equivalent of our ACLU, the Canadian Supreme Court unanimously discovered that you have a right to be murdered. You have a right to be murdered by the medical establishment with the encouragement of the Canadian government. Autonomous man has the right to die with dignity. And so the Canadian High Court gave the Canadian Parliament 1 year to come up with the appropriate legislation which would allow for euthanasia in cases of, quote, grievous and irremediable illnesses. In other words, illnesses where there's no remedy. And in 2016, in June of 2016, this became law. Parliament passed such regulations, and these regulations created the pattern and the rules in accordance with how it is Canadian citizens could be euthanized. And this original law that was passed in June of 2016 allowed that Canadians suffering from terminal physical illnesses could be, upon request, euthanized. So again, notice this. The 2016 law allowed that patients who had terminal, it had to be terminal, incurable, that's the irremediable aspect, diseases, physical, note that, diseases could in fact apply for euthanasia. And if they met all the requirements, such a person could be euthanized by a professional healthcare practitioner. By the way, not necessarily a doctor. Canada is quite unusual in allowing nurse practitioners. You don't have to be an actual doctor to administer this. And the Canadian law embraces both physician-assisted suicide as well as direct clinician-administered death. In other words, your doctor himself or your nurse practitioner physically hooking you up to an IV and starting the slow drip to eternity. The original Canadian law from June of 2016, only 7 years ago, allows this. Now, a major event occurred then in March of 2021. After various court challenges from the civil liberties community, these wonderful civil liberties people, the 2016 law was further amended by something called Bill C-7, which what this bill did was expand the definition of what constitutes a, quote, grievous and irremediable illness, unquote. This amendment permits assisted dying or euthanasia for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. Now, did you catch that? In other words, now you can be euthanized or petition to be euthanized if you have a chronic physical ailment that is not terminal, a non-life-threatening illness or disability. In other words, you don't need to be immediately dying. You don't need to be a terminal patient anymore. You can just have some kind of physical ailment that is inconvenient, painful, something you don't want to live with, a long-term disability. You're tired of spending your life in a wheelchair, whatever. Even though you may have decades of potential life ahead of you, and even though it's not beyond the pale of possibility, you might even be cured someday, nonetheless, now, as of March of 2021, you can still be put to death by the medical community with the full blessings of the state. And by the way, the medical community and the state are intertwined in Canada. Canada, if you know, is one of those nations that has a form of what we call socialized medicine. It's not, shall we say, a system in which there is a single, all-embracing standard, or shall I say authority over it, but nonetheless it is a system that embraces socialized medicine. You may remember when Obama was pushing his Obamacare and all the things associated with Obamacare. You may remember that he appealed to the Canadian system as a model. But so the Canadian law is now allows for, again, I just want to underline this so you understand this, now allows for euthanasia of people with non-terminal physical ailments. Now, notice I said physical ailments. The current law, again, Bill C-7, prohibits various mental illnesses from being considered in the grievous and irremediable category. However, this prohibition expires in March of 2024. Right now, as we speak, currently, new legislative guidelines and policy protocols are being worked upon by Parliament, which will allow the euthanasia of individuals with, quote, severe refractory mental illnesses, unquote. So now, non-terminal mental illnesses will be included in the mix. You're depressed, you're mentally ill, you have some kind of mental problem, you're eligible. You're in. You're ready to fill out, sign on the dotted line, and prepare for eternity. So you see the number of changes that have this society has gone through since the horrific enactment of this initial law back in 2016. Again, just to trace the steps. June 2016, the initial law allowed the termination of human life that was considered having a terminable illness, physical illness. Then in 2021, it was changed to allow those with chronic physical illnesses or disabilities, but not necessarily a terminal case. Non-terminal patients could be euthanized. And now for 2024, they're slated to add the mentally ill, those with some kind of mental illness to the mix. This is what we call the slippery slope. One evil leads to another. It's like the entire Canadian nation is on skis, skis provided by Prime Minister Trudeau and others of ill will, and they're skiing down this steep mountain, down into the flames of hell. That's where the Canadian nation is at right now. Now, this Canadian program, as radical as it is and extreme as it is, even though it's enjoyed popular home support, and it's, again, this kind of thing shapes the culture, this support is growing. Nonetheless, worldwide, Canada has been subject to widespread criticism for its practices. For example, even such progressives as United Nations have been questioning what's been going on in Canada. There was a group of UN human rights experts, a panel of 3 of them, recently wrote an opinion that Canada's euthanasia law appears to violate the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as they saw it, this law had a quote, discriminatory impact, unquote, on disabled people. In other words, it's something that disproportionately affects disabled people, and it was something that is inconsistent with Canada's obligations to uphold the standards, the international standards of human rights, those internationally recognized standards. So even among progressives worldwide, the Canadian program is rather controversial. Also, disability rights groups internationally have condemned the Canadian program, and we'll get more into why it is that this thing really is something that is disproportionately disfavorable, not only to those who are disabled, but to those who are impoverished as well. But the reason that various human rights advocates have criticized the Canadian euthanasia laws are as follows, and I'll just run down the gamut. One, the Canadian program lacks the necessary safeguards. There isn't the proper review process that there should be, particularly with regard to controversial cases. Secondly, the Canadian law prompts healthcare workers to actively suggest, even promote euthanasia to patients who otherwise would not have even considered it. This is one of the most controversial aspects. Thirdly, the Canadian system promotes a climate that encourages poor people who have inadequate resources to sign on the dotted line and end their woes that way. You don't have the adequate resources to take care of your health care needs because our wonderful socialized medicine won't cover all of your needs. Sign on the dotted line and your troubles will be over. This is what's happening. Reasons that human rights advocates have criticized Canada is that Canada's laws, aside from the fact that they have no mechanism or no significant mechanism for review, Canada is also the only country right now that allows nurse practitioners to actively administer lethal substances to patients. It's not just doctors. Other issues, medical authorities in Ontario and Quebec, the 2 largest provinces, note this, explicitly tell doctors not to indicate on death certificates if euthanasia was the actual cause of death. Doesn't that kind of remind you of one of our last messages, our third message on the history of euthanasia, where we talked about the Nazi doctors mailing fake death certificates to families, the families of the disabled? Here again, you see the fudging of death certificates in a so-called democratic country. Other issues that people have criticized the Canadian program. In most other countries that allow physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia, doctors are either advised or even legally forbidden to initiate a discussion involving euthanasia with their patients. Quite the opposite, however, is true in Canada, where there are no such restrictions. There's no restriction on a doctor from the doctor himself raising the issue. And secondly, in Canada, the Canadian Association of Euthanasia Providing Health Professionals even recommends, you heard that, recommends that doctors and nurses openly and proactively inform their patients that they too might be qualified for euthanasia. That euthanasia is a possible, quote, clinical care option, unquote. Don't you just love the language of the brave new world? Clinical care option. Your murder is a clinical care option. Your murder by your doctor committing homicide against you is a clinical care option, unquote. Also, in terms of the Canadian law, Canadian patients are not required to have exhausted all treatment alternatives before seeking euthanasia. Even these liberal, ultra-liberal, progressive European nations like Belgium and the Netherlands, who have been practicing euthanasia for decades now, require that you you demonstrate that you've exhausted all valid healthcare alternatives to euthanasia, but not Canada. With Canada, euthanasia can be the first thing you look for. Others, various ethicists, have criticized Canada for allowing euthanasia based exclusively upon disability. In other words, again, you don't have to be terminally ill. But, when you tell people that you're just the fact that you're disabled, you're a paraplegic, you're in a wheelchair, whatever, that you are a client for euthanasia, medically assisted murder, what is that saying? That is really implying that living a life with a disability, living a life in a wheelchair, is a life that's not worth the living. What a terrible thing to tell the disabled. If you're going around through life in a motorized wheelchair, you'd be better off dead. What are you living for? You don't have the quality of life. You'd be much happier if we start the IV with the lethal potion inside of it, and once it courses through your veins, you're delivered from this hateful existence that you're living. What a beautiful message to be sending disabled people. The equally troubling, of course, are those incidents in which people have sought euthanasia because in this land of wonderful socialized medicine, many people are not getting the adequate government support to maintain their lives with dignity. And so some of them, in desperation because of their poverty, choose this option. So you see how this thing really, it's discriminatory against the disabled and against the poor. It marginalizes them, and it really encourages them to stop being such a drain on national resources and drop dead. That seems to be the message to the disabled and to the poor. Well, let's crunch the numbers, shall we? Just as we're looking at this slippery slope where it leads. Excuse me. They've implemented this thing, over a 7-year period from 2016. And what we found is that the number of MAiD, that is medical assistance in deaths in Canada, has risen steadily by a rate of about 1/3 each year. Each year of implementation, it's gone up a third. So that's quite a substantial increase. For example, in 2021, they estimate that 10,000 people were euthanized in Canada. And remember, with Canadian law, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were all terminally ill. But then the next year, in 2022, though the national statistics are not complete, and also remember that you have this matter of Ontario and Quebec, where they don't have to put it on the death certificate. But nonetheless, it's estimated there was a 35% increase from the previous year, and that in 2022, some estimated 13,500 Canadians were, and I'll use this term, executed by the healthcare system, state-sanctioned homicides, sanctioned by the Canadian government, the awful Canadian government. So just think of that. Last year, 13,500 Canadians were put to death this way. Their crime was that they got sick. It's interesting. You can execute people in Canada for being sick or poor, and soon they'll be lucky and soon mentally ill, but they don't execute criminals, which is what the state's supposed to be doing, executing criminals. But they do execute babies, innocent babies with abortion. They do execute sick people with euthanasia. This is what happens to a society. It bottoms out. Now, Quebec, that's an interesting case study. My son is a counselor, and he did, when he was in college, he did some studies in Quebec, field assignment, and Quebec is an area that has long dealt with an epidemic of depression and suicide. This is the French-speaking part of Canada, just a very depressed area. And what that area needs is missionaries, not death panels. But Quebec saw a 51% uptick in MAiD deaths, medically assisted deaths, from 2,427 in 2021 to 3,663 in 2022. 51% uptick in 1 year. Astonishing. Of people who were euthanized in that one province. In Quebec, 7% now of all deaths in the year 2022 were state-assisted or state-sanctioned suicides, euthanasia deaths, making this, note this, the third top cause of death in the Quebec province in 2022, only behind cancer and heart disease. So there's your three top causes of death in Quebec: cancer, heart disease, euthanasia. Is it just me, or is that rather astonishing that euthanasia has reached these proportions? Now, all of this is due in part to the heavy promotion that's been going on from both within the Canadian healthcare system and the Canadian government. Of course, again, both of these are heavily intertwined with Canada's socialistic healthcare system. But various critics observed that this nation is on the perilous road to mass euthanasia. There's ever more pressure on the sick, the disabled, the poor, in a climate of diminishing resources to end their lives prematurely. You look at these postmodern, post-industrial, post-Christian Western nations like Canada that are in decline, less and less young people to care for a growing elderly population, a growing sick population, and These government managers and healthcare managers, they're under pressure. They have quotas, they have expenses to deal with, and there is this pressure that various people who are just a drain on national resources, they need to check out. I'll quote here Alex Schadenberg, who's a anti-euthanasia activist in Canada. He's quoted by the Daily Mail. He says, quote, "Every major healthcare institution has a MAiD team, which will literally approach everyone who may qualify for MAiD and ask them if they want to die." Think about that. That's an extraordinary quote. Schadenberg goes on to say that these MAiD teams in clinics, they aggressively push for sick people to opt out in this way. He describes, this is very disturbing, cases where medics will ask the terminally ill as many as 5 times if they want to end their own lives. Can you imagine this? You're lying there and you're sick, and your medical doctor comes up to you. The person who, if we're going by the Hippocratic Oath, should be working to do you no harm, this person comes up to you and says, "Don't you want to die? Would you like me to put you to sleep?" "No." That's time number 1. Time number 2, "Do you want me to put you to sleep?" "No." Time number 3, "Do you want me to put you to sleep?" "No." Time number 4, "Do you want me to put you to sleep? You want to go to sleep?" "No." Number 5, "Come on, end your misery." "No." 5 times? Friends, do you see that as a little bit abusive? Again, Mr. Schadenberg, who's done a lot of work in this area, says, quote, "The selling of MAiD by MAiD teams is a big reason why the numbers are skyrocketing. If you're going to pay people to be on a MAiD team, they will sell what they're offering," unquote. Okay, they're justifying their existence. You're part of a medical assistance in death team. You're going to want some business, is what Schadenberg is saying. Likewise, Daniel Zechveld, who represents ARPA Canada, a Christian advocacy group, says this, quote, "Safeguards continue to be relaxed, and euthanasia is increasingly offered as an easy solution to suffering." And then finally another quote, which I find most instructive, from Charles Lewis of the National Catholic Register. He writes, quote, "In Canada, a nightmare has emerged. After 7 years of legalized euthanasia, the killing of the sick and the vulnerable, I believe that we have passed the point of no return. What was thought at first by a vast majority to be a reasonable law, a law that its promoters swore would have no slippery slope, has turned into a tragic mistake, a mistake that most likely cannot be rectified given recent court decisions. The original framers of the euthanasia law assumed that they could control the whirlwind. Those of us who warned that there was a very slippery slope ahead were written off as cranks and fearmongers. But now that euthanasia is considered a right, I believe there's no going back. Courts are loath to take away rights, especially those considered progressive, unquote. Again, that was Charles Lewis of the National Catholic Register. The Catholic Church, I must give them credit, has been well ahead of the curve in some of these sanctity of life issues. When Roe v. Wade came out, the Catholic Church really, even before evangelicals, really drew a bead on this as to what was wrong with it. And same is true with this matter of euthanasia. Of course, whenever government policy is involved and there's an endorsement by the medical establishment, this only adds to the legitimacy of the procedure, and the slippery slope continues. So looking here at some more statistics, many Canadians now support euthanasia because of the culture of death that has emerged. Lethal injections have become normalized, and the public in general largely seems to be behind this state policy, as various disturbing recent polls would indicate. A survey released in May of this year showed that, listen to this, some 30% of Canadian voters are fine with the extreme idea of dealing with the poor and the homeless in this manner. Now think about that, friends. Is this not a dystopia? Whenever you see 13,500 Canadians executed a year, and where now 30%, about a third of Canadians, think that euthanasia should be used to deal with their social problems, like poverty and homelessness. Is that Canada, by the way, or is this the Third Reich we're talking about? From my vantage point, they're starting to look a lot alike. That's how you solve poverty? That's how you solve homelessness? By executing people? 30% of Canadians seem to think it's okay. But you see, you have this culture going on for 7 years, endorsed by the government, endorsed by the medical establishment, endorsed by the progressive social theorists, the social engineers, the civil liberties groups, and there you have it. The public follows. They follow like lemmings, right off the edge of the cliff. Here's a good quote. Tim Stainton, Stainton, who's the director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship, described this law as, quote, probably the biggest existential threat to disabled people since the Nazis' program in Germany in the 1930s, unquote. And Pope Francis, by the way, in his recent trip to Canada, also weighed in. Even this liberal hippie Pope is disturbed by what he's seeing. He has criticized what he calls Canada's culture of waste, which considers elderly and disabled people disposable. I think that's a good term, the culture of waste. We view human beings as little more than a used-up paper plate ready to be discarded in the trash once they aren't profitable anymore. Pope says, quote, we need to learn how to listen to the pain of the poor and the most marginalized. He goes on to say these patients are those who, quote, in place of affection are administered death, unquote. Usually I don't care much for Pope Francis, but right here he's spot on. So you have the slippery slope, which we already went through. We talked about 2015. The Supreme Court declared that you have a right to die and demanded that by 2016 legislation be crafted to allow for such in terminal physical cases. 2016, that law was enacted by Parliament, allowing people aged 18 or over, provided they meet the necessary conditions, if they have a serious advanced terminal disease or disability that's causing pain or suffering, that they would be eligible through euthanasia. 2021, the law was amended to allow people who are not terminally ill but have some other form of physical illness to fall under the guidelines and to petition for euthanasia. Now, that brings us to 2024, next year. The country is set, once they work out the guidelines, to allow people to be killed exclusively for mental health issues, whether it be depression, mental illness, whatever. And it's also considering extending euthanasia to, quote, mature minors, unquote. That is, children under the age of 18 who meet the same requirements as adults. And the slippery slope continues. Down and down and down and down. Down into uttermost darkness. This is what happens when the soul falls out of a society. This happened in 7 years. Friends, we see the same thing expanding in the United States. We talked about the 10 jurisdictions in the United States that allow for this. Will the same happen to us soon? I think it will. We're on that. We're on the track. Let's put it that way. Just want to leave you with some controversial case examples that I've uncovered in my research. I think you need to hear these. I know this message is getting a little long, but you need to hear these because this deals in the end with real people. We've been talking about big numbers. We've been talking about general ideas and policies. But friends, it comes down to people, individuals. Here's some of the people we're talking about, some of these controversial case examples that happened in the real world in the last couple years in our friendly, wonderful neighbor to the north, the Great White North, Canada. There's the case of Alan Nichols, a 61-year-old man who had battled depression and various physical ailments, but who had no life-threatening condition. In the year 2019, Alan was put to death over the objections of his family and over concerns raised by his nurse practitioner. Alan, again, had no condition that was life-threatening. His application for euthanasia only listed one health condition for the reason for his request to die: hearing loss. Hearing loss. Alan's family, when they found out about his death, they were horrified. They had stated that he wasn't being given the help to deal with his ear implants and so forth, but there was no good reason why Alan should have been counseled in this way to give up. They reported his death to the Canadian Mounties, the Royal Canadian Mounties, the police, because they considered it a criminal act. They reported it to the appropriate Canadian health authorities, only to be given the cold shoulder by both the state and by the healthcare establishment. These concerns were promptly dismissed because all the I's had been dotted, all the T's had been crossed. It was legal. Don't bother us. You see, here's the problem when you don't have proper oversight over your system. Of course, you shouldn't have such a system in the first place. Then there's the case of another individual, Sean Taggart, a young man of 41 years of age who was put to death by the Canadian health authorities on August of 2019. And this is a classic example of how disabled Canadians who are impoverished are often the victims of this kind of thing. Even though Canada is this wonderful socialist healthcare kind of a thing, the fact is Sean was unable to afford the 24-hour day care that he needed, as well as the specialized medical equipment that he needed in order to stay at home. Institutionalization, because of family issues, was not really an option. More and more, Sean came to see it that death was really his own way out of this nightmare. And so he signed on the dotted line. And in August of 2019, he was put to death. One professor at the University of Alberta, Heidi Jantz, commenting on this case, says that, quote, "A person with disabilities in Canada has to jump through so many hoops to get support that alone often is enough to tip the scales," unquote. That is leading to euthanasia. The person just despairs. Socialist healthcare systems are not the utopia they promise to be. You still go broke in such societies trying to get adequate resources And if you have euthanasia in place, well, this is the way out for those who are desperate, impoverished, like Sean. Other cases involve unsettling, frightening discussions between people who want to live, who are fighting for their life, and various Canadian authorities who want them to die. Let's consider the case of Roger Foley. Roger, a man who has degenerative brain disorder and who's hospitalized in London, Ontario, he was so alarmed, I was reading this account here, but by staffers mentioning euthanasia, that he began to secretly record some of their conversations. Now, I had mentioned earlier about how sometimes 5 times a person will be approached. Do you want to die? You think that would be a good thing? How these physicians and healthcare workers are trying to push this on people who otherwise wouldn't even consider it. But in one conversation, which was obtained by the Associated Press, the AP, the hospital's director of ethics met with Roger. Roger recorded the conversation. And Roger was warned that his continuing healthcare costs would cost, quote, north of $1,500 a day. That's how much it costs to keep you alive, Roger. Foley replied to this director of ethics that mentioning these kind of fees sort of felt like coercion. It made him uncomfortable. And he asked this man, what plan is there for my long-term care? And here's the answer he got, quote, Roger, this is not my show. That's what the director says. Roger, this is not my show. My piece of this was to talk to you, to see that if you had an interest in assisted dying, unquote. Foley went on to state that he never had previously even mentioned euthanasia. The hospital, in response to this, stated there's no prohibition on our staff in raising this issue with patients. How heartwarming. How heartwarming. I remember even here in this country, you're thinking about foreshadowing what could happen in the United States. My father was in a long-term health care facility after the local hospital transferred him there because his condition required longer-term care. There was a radically progressive doctor who was on staff at this institution, and she kept encouraging him to give up. She told him, you're being poked and prodded. Don't you just want to be released? That's how she was talking. Now, this is the state of Pennsylvania where we have no legal euthanasia. But you see, even in this kind of climate, there are certain awful people who will attempt to encourage their people to give up. So if euthanasia does come to this country, believe me, there will be, especially with the greater and greater cooperation between medicine and government, there will be an effort to hasten people's demise. I'll give you 2 more cases. Candace Lewis is a 25-year-old woman who has CP and who also has spina bifida. Candace was taken to an emergency room in Newfoundland province about 5 years ago. And Sheila Elson, her mother, was approached by a doctor who told her that her daughter Candace was a prime candidate for euthanasia, and that her mother chose not to pursue it. Why? That would be, quote, selfish, unquote. How selfish of Candace wanting to continue living. How selfish of you, her mother, allowing her to continue this way. You see, friends, by the way, that's reported by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC. See, friends, how the right to die quickly turns into the duty to die. It always happens. Finally, this is the last shocking case, Christine Gauthier, a Canadian veteran. This is how this society now treats its veterans. a woman who has quite a number of physical problems that put her in a wheelchair and incapacitated her. Nonetheless, she's a fighter. Christine is a fighter. She participates in various these Special Olympic kind of events that they have for disabled people. She's trying to do everything she can to hold on to her dignity and to fight for her life. She revealed, and this was quite sensational when this was revealed, that last year she was, quote, shocked and in despair, unquote, when her caseworker, representing the Canadian healthcare system, approached her offering MAiD, medical assistance in death. Why don't you be euthanized, Christine? You're not living a life worth living. You're in a wheelchair. And you keep hassling us about these delays with regard to having this wheelchair lift installed in your home. Don't you know this stuff is expensive? You know, we have a budget here in Canada. Our wonderful socialized Medicare system needs to continue. Christine, you'd be better off checking out. This is the nightmare. This is the dystopia that is now Canada. Trudeau's paradise. And I don't retract for a moment calling him an awful man, calling his government an awful government, a dishonorable government, a wicked government, a government that does not protect its people but abuses them. And it abuses the disabled and the impoverished to a disproportionate extent. And soon we'll be able to add, children to that, the mentally ill, the depressed. Can we add them to the list too? All these people who are disenfranchised and have no power, but who are an obstacle to the state. Well, our conclusion, again, we come full circle to Genesis 11:6. Sin grows. Remember what was stated about the generation of the Tower of Babel. And now, nothing that they propose to do will become impossible for them. That's what happened to Canada. What starts out as small and dim in the beginning grows by degree into something of gigantic proportions. Sin grows. The potential of fallen man for evil and to engage in wicked enterprises is terrible, and it is powerful. This is a wonderful case study of what happens when we set aside the principle of the sanctity of human life, which is what we've been talking about these last number of weeks, and we see that in the end there's no limitations. Once you've accepted that principle, you end up like Canada, a country that's sliding all the way to hell, and that's where we're at, friends. Part of the reason that we're engaging in these messages is to educate and alert the public that we don't see our own fair land go in the same direction. Well, friends, it's been quite an extensive study, but I trust that this information, that you found it to be most valuable, most enlightening. You don't hear this talked about much on the news, do you? Well, what's happening up north and what's happening is a nightmare. But again, if you found this information useful, pass it on to your friends, recommend it to your friends. Well, that's all we have for you this week, friends. Next week, as we talk about this matter of the sanctity of human life, I want to deal with something that is widespread on our planet today, and that is the great sin of oppression, something that the Bible talks about over and over again, and something which is an abomination to the Lord, and something which the Lord judges. Well, until next time, friends, this is Pastor Terry Reese. May the Lord indeed be with you.